With the signing of the 1930 First London Treaty, the tonnage of Japan's destroyer fleet was capped, both individually and totally. At the same time, they still wanted ships that were better than anyone else. As a result, the last 6 Akatsukis were canceled, and in 1931, Japan started the first of the 6 smaller 1,490-ton Hatsuharu Class. 12 were originally ordered, but due to the near disaster that was their construction, the last 6 were reordered as the follow-on Hatsuharu Class. All things considered, I would say these guys were as big a mess than their cruiser contemporaries, the Mogamis. Ouch. That is to say, despite sacrificing 1 barrel from turret 2, they had major fundamental problems, weight and strength problems that were ignored on the drawing board, but once they hit the water, couldn't be ignored. Problems highlighted by the Tomozuru and then the 4th Fleet incidents. This resulted in them being built in basically 3 groups of 2. All were built with more frames than previous destroyers. That's good. Unfortunately, each frame was significantly weaker than previous ones. That's bad. The first 2 were completed to the original design. This meant they had to go back in for reconstruction to correct their lateral stability issues following the Tomozuru incidents. They then had to go back in again after the 4th Fleet incident to correct longitudinal strength problems. This included thickening longitudinal beams and replacing the welding that was standard for everything Japanese with rivets. Most ships would still use welding in their superstructure, but most classes from now on would have at least their hull riveted. The second pair were completed with the top weight reductions already done, but still had to go back in to have their frames stiffened. The third pair were completed with all the changes made. They were also originally completed with 2 rudders, but this was soon changed to 1 large one as was standard. They were also somewhat wider to increase their stability. Hatsuharu was started May 14, 1931, and was completed September 30, 1933. Ninoi was started December 15, 1931, and was completed also September 30, 1933. Hatsushima was started January 29, 1933, and was completed September 27, 1934. Wakaba was started December 12, 1932, and was completed October 31, 1934. Yuguri was started April 9, 1933, and was completed March 30, 1935. Araki was started January 14, 1933, and was completed March 25, 1935. Main armament was 5 of the standard 127mm 50 caliber guns in 2 twin and 1 single mounts. To save weight, these guns could only elevate to 55 degrees. In the first 2, Hatsuharu and Ninoi, the single turret originally superfired turret 1 atop a raised gunhouse on the forecastle deck, but the other 4 were completed with a single turret aft, back-to-back of turret 3 on the main deck. Torpedo armament on the first 2 was originally 3 triple torpedo banks, all with splinter shields. 1 on a stand to port between the 2 funnels, with a reload locker behind it next to the rear funnel, which was shifted to starboard to make room for the locker. The second was behind the rear funnel, lower on the main deck, thank goodness, with a reload behind it in the aft superstructure. The third bank was on top of the aft superstructure above the second bank's reloads. Behind it were the reloads for those tubes, so 18 torpedoes. They carried the Type 90 610mm torpedo. 18 depth charges were initially carried, but they had no sonar. Type 93 sonar was added before the war, though. Propulsion was provided by 3 boilers, each in their own room, end to end. The first 2 vented to the forward funnel, with the rear one venting to the rear funnel. These provided steam to the 2 turbines, each driving one of the 2 propellers to generate 42,000 horsepower for an initial speed of 36 knots in the first 2, but only 33 knots in them and the others after their yard work. Modifications were substantial the first 2 after the Tomozuru incident and their trials. The third torpedo bank and its reloads were removed along with most of the rear superstructure. The single turret was moved back to where the number 3 gun was, where it could be lower and the hull was wider, replacing most of the rear superstructure. The gun house it had sat on and part of the bridge was removed. The number 1 torpedo bank was moved to the center line, and the reloads were angled inward. On top of other minor things, 84 tons of ballast was added along with bulges. The second and third pairs were completed with this work already done. After the 4th Fleet incidents, the first 2 pairs were taken back in, the third pair being modified while under construction. The frames and keel were stiffened. All this brought the class as a whole up to 1,715 tons, capable of 33 knots. Hatsuharu landed her single 127mm gun in exchange for more medium anti-aircraft, Type 22 radar, and an increase in depth charges to 36 while undergoing repairs from November 1942 through September 1943. You heard that right. Repairs and upgrades took almost a year. In late July through early August 1944, she received Type 13 radar. In mid-January through mid-February 1943, Araki landed her single 127mm gun in exchange for more medium anti-aircraft, Type 22 radar, and an increase in depth charges to 36. Hatsushimo landed her single 127mm gun in exchange for more medium anti-aircraft and an increase in depth charges to 36 in September 1943. She also received Type 22 radar in May of 1944 and Type 13 radar in September 1944. Wakaba landed her single 127mm gun in exchange for more medium anti-aircraft, Type 22 radar, and an increase in depth charge to 36 in September through October 1943. In mid-July through mid-August 1942, she received Type 13 radar. Hatsuharu started the war in home waters, but in January 1942 joined the East Indies invasion. During the Battle of Midway, she was part of the Aleutians invasion force and mostly operated afterwards in northern waters. Near Kiska on October 17, 1942, a bomb wrecked her stern and she had to limp back to home. Repairs at Japan would last almost a year, after which she headed back north. At the Battle of Surigao Strait, she was part of the 5th Fleet's follow-up force. On November 14, 1944, she was bombed and sunk in Manila Bay. Ariake started the war in home waters. In mid-January 1942, she hooked up with Kido Butai and escorted the carriers through mid-March. Next, she took part in the Battle of the Coral Sea. In June 1942, she was part of the Aleutians invasion force. On December 26, 1942, she was bombed and heavily damaged while trying to tow Uzuki, sending her back to Japan for repairs. With repairs completed in mid-February 1943, she headed back south. Near Cape Gloucester on July 28, 1943, she was bombed and sunk. Hatsushimo started the war in home waters. In January 1942, she took part in the East Indies conquest. In June 1942, she was part of the Aleutians invasion force and pretty much stayed there. In late March 1943, she took part in the Battle of Komandorski. On a foggy July 26, 1943, she was at the center of a three-ship pileup, damaging her bow and stern. With repairs back at Japan completed in mid-October 1943, she escorted the tankers at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. At the Battle of Surigao Strait, she was part of the follow-up cruiser force. At the start of April 1945, she survived escorting Yamato in the Tengo sortie. While dodging bombs in Miatsu Bay on July 30, 1945, she hit a mine and sunk. Ninohi started the war in home waters. In January 1942, she joined in the conquest of the East Indies. In June 1942, she covered the invasion of the Aleutians. Near Agatu Island on July 4, 1942, she was sunk by the submarine Triton. Wakaba started the war in home waters attached to the battle fleet. In January, she joined in the conquest of the East Indies. In June, she took part in the Aleutians conquest and mostly stayed there. In March 1943, she took part in the Battle of Komandorski. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf, she was part of the cruiser follow-up force at Surigao Strait and was sunk October 24th by carrier aircraft. Yuguri started the war in home waters. In January 1942, she joined Kido Butai in supporting the East Indies invasion. In May 1942, she escorted the carriers at the Battle of the Coral Sea. In June 1942, she was part of the Aleutians invasion force. In late August 1942, she transferred to the Solomons. Despite many Tokyo Express runs, her next major action was the July 12, 1943 Battle of Kalimbangara. Overnight on July 20, 1943, near Kalimbangara, she was bombed and sunk by Avengers using radar. The night was no longer safe from airstrike.